Just wanted to read just Nogay Timnitz of whatever we want to talk about. I just thought that if you remember, I was working very hard last week. What's the Ram's Raya Ruba de Reise? So this question was fielded to the Rambam's great grandson, Rabbi Shua Nogid, on Mitzvah Kufayin Hey. Says Kates of the Forish Dvorov b'Mitzvah Kufayin Hey. V'feirish Omer Ruba de Reise. V'zeh b'Mitzvahs Achrei Rab Lahatos. What does it mean? What does the Rambam want? See, Tshuva Zeh K'dei L'tzayin Divrei Chachamim She'achrei Rab Lahatos Mitzvah Menuya. This is a raya that Achrei Rab Lahatos is the Mitzvah Minyan Mitzvahs Mitzvah Menuya. V'u Omeru that the Matikei Shmua said Ruba de Reise. Kloima. Ruba de Reise means Menuya. Uklal biyotcha shebechol mokim shehu mazkir chachomim or kishu oimer v'loshen sifro v'loshen tesefta v'loshen gemor ploni bechol mitzvah hari ze chizuk ubio. It's an added proof and an explanation lemitzvah shei benuya. Why it's menuya? V'zehu she'oma b'akdomo v'oviraya al kol mipsuke haTorah u'midivrei chachomim zal. He's going to be raya in all the mitzvahs midivrei chachomim. Al tasich daiter miklal zeh b'chol mitzvah shu maskir bo divrei chachomim shu klal godo. So this is all very good. The only question is, you fall into the trap of the Tashbet's question. Not every time it says deraisa, is it a mitzvah? Like Chatzitzim deraisa. And that's what I discussed last week and had an approach to try to explain what the Ram's proof is. But I think it's important that Rabbi Shua Nogid took from the point, the approach that we assumed is that every time the Ram quotes a Sifra, Sifri, or whatever he's quoting, it's to prove that something is a mitzvah, minyan mitzvahs. Okay, now I'd like to add a few things here and there about Sanhedrin. So I think I pointed out last week that the Ram has a mitzvah of Minui the Sanhedrin. It doesn't stop with the Minui. It continues the way they act and what their tafkid is. And Rav Sadi Goin does not count a mitzvah of Minui Sanhedrin. And I assumed that it's Akdama and maybe shouldn't be counted because of Shurish Yud. Now, the Rambam is a very important term. I think I talked about it last week, but I'd like to speak about it a little bit more. I think it's a very important phrase. The Rambam says, "Mitnai mitzvah zo, shiyu hasheftim or elu, madrega l'mayla madrega." And we pointed out that really Kapach's translation, dalga l'mayla midalga, is a much better thing. And there are various levels. Dalga l'mayla midalga. So I pointed out one of the examples is that Sanhedrin Agodol is Mamuna, is L'mayla, Mehamamunim, be Sanhedrin Ktana. And I was wondering, what he says over here, we'll move into it. He says like this. Mitnai mitzazo, shiyu hasheftim u'elu, dalga l'mayla midalga, v'zo b'shiyismanu b'chol ir, shleishi v'esrim dayonim, mukubotzim kulam b'mokim echod b'shari ir, shiruy l'mitzvah zeh. V'elu hein, Sanhedrin Ketana. V'yismanu b'Yushalayim Beis Din HaGadol Mishivim Dayanim. This is Lamaila from the one before. And that l'chayra is what he says later in the Sefer, that he says, V'da she'ela manuyin kulam, klemis and hedjig. No, before that. Blosh Sifri, minayin shemamanim Beis Din l'chol Yisrael, tamaloyma sheitim v'sheitim, uminayin shemamanim echod al gabe kulon, tamaloyma titin l'chol. So this is echod al gabe kulon. Now, what I'd like to discuss with you, what does he mean, Yerushalayim? So I think I mentioned last week something about the Yerushalayim in his terms, the Baal HaMeseira. I'm not sure that's pshat at all. I think what the Rambam says is basically every city has a Sanhedrin. But the Sanhedrin is a Sanhedrin of 23. The city of Yerushalayim, it's Sanhedrin, it's not a Sanhedrin of 23, it's a Sanhedrin of 71. V'yismanu, first he says, B'chol year v'year, and then he says, V'yismanu b'Yerushalayim. And Yerushalayim has a different type of Sanhedrin. Beis Din HaGadol Mishivim Dayanim. V'yismanu echod al elu hashivim. It's l'mayla mizu in the darga that there's someone who's on top of who Rosh Yeshiva or a Nasi. And now we pointed out that this is also darga, that the Rosh Yeshiva or the Nasi is l'mayla from the Sanhedrin. If that's correct, I'd like to make another step. So, if that's the case, we understand that the question is, so he doesn't mention Sanhedrin of Pesach Hazorah and Pesach Harabayis because that's not the Sanhedrin of the year. And he's mentioning the Sanhedrin of the year. And the Sanhedrin, we pointed out, is only for the Biur the Meseira, as the Ram in Perek Aleph Hilchos Mamrim, and Perek Gimel of Hilchos Mamrim, Perek Aleph Halacha Daled, and Perek Gimel Halacha Ches. Now, I want to suggest something. Maybe it's true the Rambam mentioned Darga Gabi Darga, but the Ikvius, according to Sefer HaMitzvos, is that each year should have either a Sanhedrin or Yerushalayim should have a Sanhedrin HaGadol, and an year that doesn't have, that's not real for Sanhedrin Ketana, should have a Beis Din of Gimel. That is what's going on in Sefer HaMitzvos. So we understand the whole purpose he's talking about Zul L'mayla Mizu, excuse me, not Zul, that each year the year Yerushalayim, and then he says the year Shanoshim Mu'atim She'enu Ru'il Sanhedrin Ketana Yismanu Bo Shloisha Laseis Hadayonim Haketanim V'Adova Koshe Yuviu L'mi Shelamayla V'hem. However, maybe in Mishnah Torah, the Ika is a hierarchy, Zol L'mayla Mizol. And the mitzvah is not necessarily or not completely about Sanhedrin the whole year of the year, or only the whole year of the year. First of all, independent of everything, l'chol the Sanhedrin HaGadol in Mishnah Torah are l'mayla because they are miman in the Sanhedrin Ketana. As the Ram says in Perek Loch Aleph, they know Sanhedrin Ketana, L'chol Shev v'Shev, L'chol Ir v'Ir, El Alpi Bezdin Shel Shivim B'Echad. And therefore, the Rambam changes his whole approach, and he starts in Mishnah Torah by Sanhedrin Agadol, because the whole Kvius is Daga L'mayla Medaga. Kama Botei Din and Kvuyin Hoi Yisrael, Koim Betchila Sanhedrin Agadol B'Mikdash, and then on and on and on, because we're going from Daga L'mayla and Daga L'mata. Here in Mishnah Torah, after he mentions Sanhedrin Agadol, he says, Oisin. He says, Koivim Betchila Bezna Agadol B'Mikdash, Vu Anikla Sanhedrin Gedola, the Oid Maminim Shnei Botei Dinim Shel Esem U'Shloisha. Esem U'Shloisha. Echad Al Pesach Hazor, the Echad Al Pesach Al Bayis. He mentions this in Mishnah Torah, does not mention in this, and it's part of the mitzvah, it's describing the mitzvah. He doesn't mention it in Sefer HaMitzvos. And then Ma'amina b'chol yir v'yir miYisrael sheyesh bo me'eh v'esrim o yoyses Sanhedrin Ketana. So I'd like to tell you about a Rambam in Perek Beis of Hilchos Sanhedrin Halacha Ches. He says like this: Oisin oisei dayin bi'iroi. He's talking about a bezdin of Chav Gimel. And if he has certain milas, you need certain milas in order to be a mamuna. Umishom malin oisa lepesach harabayis. And when a person, he becomes a greater dayan of a greater stature, he moves up next echelon, next darga. Malin oisa lepesach harabayis. Umishom malin oisa lepesach hazorah. Umishom malin oisa lebezdin agadol. So it means after the dargis are keveya, and the mitzvah is if you want to use the bezdin agadol, the bezdin agadol, I'm a man of the darga below it, Azora Harabayis, B'chol Yir V'Yir of Sanhedrin Ketana, and then Bezdin of Gimel. So the Ika Keveya in Mishnah Torah is Darga Zula Ma'ila Mizul. I assume what we said last week should also be included, because the mitzvah of Bezdin of Chav Gimel in Harabayis Nazorah, they didn't have court cases. The Ram doesn't discuss court cases in Perek Aleph of Hilchos Mamim and in Perek Gimel. So I assume that the mitzvahs mini Sanhedrin includes also an issue of the Messiah. But that's not the answer by itself. And I assume in Sefer HaMitzvos it doesn't include the issue of the Messiah. But the important thing is that it's Zul L'mayla Mizul in Mishnah Torah, and in Sefer HaMitzvos, it's just that each ear requires a Sanhedrin. That's what he's referring to, and that's why he's makbid Ubi Yerushalayim Yismanu L'Sanhedrin Agod. That's what I wanted to suggest this week. Now, and we spoke about the Sheitrim. I'd like us to add a few interesting points to Sheitrim. The Sheitrim, the Ram says that they're in the marketplace. B'shvokim. So I assume that the Ika, Ovel, and Oshek that you could have Ashkocha on was in the marketplace, and therefore the place of the Shoitrim is the marketplace. V'yabitu in Yonei Om b'iskeim ad shelo yaseh ovel v'afilu b'davar mut. Now, I'm also in Hilchos Sanhedrin. Perek Aleph Halacha Aleph Shoitrim elu balei makel u'ritzua v'heim oimdim lifnei hadayonim hamisavim b'shvokim v'v'choivos v'al hachanuyos l'saken ha'she'orim v'amidos. So here, even Tibbet does the same type of thing in look here, he talks about Shvokim v'choivos. In Kapach, there's no rechoivos. Okay, I assume, and it's not in the Arabic. I assume that Ibn Tibbon here he didn't take it from Minyan HaKotz, he took it from Mishnah Torah and Perek Aleph Halacha Aleph. Now, interesting, there's another Rambam. The Rambam in Hilchos Geneva, Perek Ches Halacha Chof. Chayovim Bezdin lahamid shoitrim b'chol Medina u'Medina u'b'chol plach u'plach shiu machazrin al hachanuyos u'mitzadkin es hamoznayim the midos mishkolos the es hamidos midos mishkolos u'poiskin es hasholem v'chol mi shenimsi imo mishkol choser or mida chasero or muznayim mekukolim v'shush yes lehem la kaisai. Interesting, the word rishus, it's like an opportunity to that you rely on the judgment of the shoter whether this warrants to be hit or not. Yesh rishus lahan la'akos l'kafi koichay u'lakantz kafi reis bezdin l'chazik adol. B'chol mi shemafkiz ashar moiche biyoike makanois v'koipanoisai u'moiche sha'ashok. So it's very interesting in Rambam. L'chore the two mechayvim of shoitrim. There's a mechayiv of shoitrim b'terech shoitim v'shoitim titel l'chol from the mitzvah in Hilchos Sanhedrin, and therefore he puts in Hilchos Sanhedrin. And there's another mechayiv. The other mechayiv is the mitzvah of midas mushkolis, and therefore he puts in Hilchos Geneva, where he discusses the midah of that mitzvah. And this is based on a Rimagash in Baba Basra, Pei Testament Aleph, Tona Abonon, Yiyah L'cho Melamed, Shemaminim, Agam Demin, Lemidois, Lebezdin Kol Masir, Lahu. It's a tzivu on Bezdin, Kol Mahazil Achmona. Sheyimnu Odei Memuna Al Amidois, Sheyshakin Oisam, V'yachtem Aleim, B'choismoi, Kedei Shelo Yimsam Aramoy, Mokom L'Ramois. There was a general stamp that you need a certificate, your midas were proper. chomish nimsa shemoide b'midah she'enu aleo oisei chesem makin oisei v'yonchin oisei. V'sugi d'shmaid ma'midim agon ben l'miz ben l'shorim kloima she'igzo abal echanuya shelo yemoichin b'chol. This is the second halacha. Now, next, I pointed out there was another tafkid in Hilchos Sanhedrin that they're makan erva, okay, and they're not makan erva. They bring the people who violate. They bring the avalion to Bezdin kavua for din. Now, what I want to point out is something interesting. I told you last week. I think I told you that the Ram in Hilchos Yontif says Chayovim Bezdin lahamid sheitrim bergolim shiu mesavim mechapsim beginois upardesim ve'anayres kedei shelo yiskapsu lecho v'lishtois shom anoshim v'noshim v'yavoli de avera. So it starts in the Elvis Dover. It's a different type of thing. You see, in Hilchos Sanhedrin, the Elvis Dover is after the fact to bring them to Bezdin in order to have a trial. So he says, "V'chol sheyiru bo Elvis Dover v'vinois to the Bezdin v'don nois l'kafi rishon." And Yontif, it's not after the fact; it's to prevent the Elvis Dover. Since the time of Yayin and Kalis Roish, men and women together, and that's maybe the more so they were makbid in Simchas Beis Shoeva, to be a separation. At times of great simcha, there's more need for separation. And the sheitrim or mefakrim to see that through Simchas Yontif shouldn't come a michshel. That's the pshat. And that's what he says. In Hilchos Yontif, in Perek Vav Alachachof, she'odem oichel v'sheiseh v'someich b'regel lo yamshich b'yayin v'schoik v'kalas roish v'yoyim shekol mi she'yeseh b'zeh yava mitzvah simcha she'ashiklas aschoik harbe v'kalas roish eino simcha el hoilus hasichus ulo tzavinu al hoilus hasichus el al simcha she'esh ba'avoilus yotzeh. I just want to add something to this. This is Mike probably out of the purview, but I'm sure you'll find it interesting. Rab Gershon used to, used to say that his Zayda, the Chofetz Chaim, used to give Musa bein hakofa la'akofa. And just an aside, it's not important for anything now. One of the main topics that he gave Musa about was smoking. In Yiddish, was darf man das, what he needed for, efsh is nicht gesund, it's not healthy, tips, kedema. So why is the akofis the time for Musa? So the answer is, the Chofetz Chaim saw that the mitzvah simcha is supposed to be simcha sheish ba'avodas hayotzeh, and shouldn't be hoilus. So this was the time to give Musa, in order to dampen the simcha from hoilus to a point of simcha sheish b'avodas Hashem. Now next. Derech Agav, I don't want to talk about this now. It's clear over here that Espoli Shivim Ish is a he says it's a nichpal, okay? In Mishnah Torah, I'm not sure that's the case. He just might want to bring a raya that Sanhedrin is 71. Look at the lashon and see if he assumes that it's nichbal. B'dah. She'elo menuyin kulam, kloimas, and hedging gedol lektana, ubezn shloisa, min amnuyim, omnom yiu kulam be'eretz Yisrael behechach. And in Kapach, it's be'eretz Yisrael dafka. This is only Eretz Yisrael. The ain't smicha b'chutz la'aretz, and it's not with a vav. It should be like Kapach, I think. Ain't smicha b'chutz la'aretz. Therefore, you need it in Eretz Yisrael. Ukishniskayma smicha be'eretz Yisrael, or efshel l'soimchin l'smuchim hohein sheishpetu be'aretz b'chutz la'aretz. Once they have the minui and the smicha, they can operate wherever they want. Eretz Yisrael b'chutz la'aretz. B'zeu inyan omram Sanhedrin noheges be'eretz Yisrael b'chutz la'aretz. So the question one should ask themselves is, what does the Rambam want with this? Why is it the place in Minyan HaMitzvos to discuss? In Minyan HaMitzvos to discuss the Sanhedrin is noegen chutz la'aretz. Because he himself says Oz efshel smuch mehem v'zeh inyan omrom Sanhedrin noheges be'aretz u'b'chutz la'aretz. It's not, and he says, and that's the pshat in the Sefer that he quotes. So l'chayra, the fact that Sanhedrin is done both in Eretz Yisrael and Chutz La'aretz is nothing to do with the mitzvah. The mitzvah is the mini Sanhedrin. And Shoftim v'Shoftim Titin l'chol sharecha was not formulated in Chutz La'aretz, according to the Rambam. And that's pretty clear from the Rambam Mishnah Torah. In fact, because of this, the Ramban goes out of his way in Chumash, in two places. Let's deal with one place now. In Dvorim Perek Tezayin Pasuk Yudches, Al Meseches Machis Shanu, V'hoyu Eila Lachem L'chukas Mishpot L'Dorisechem, B'chol Moish V'Seichem, Malamed Sanhedrin Noegis Ba'aretz B'chutz La'aretz. In Cain, Lo Manema Shoftim V'Shoftim Titin L'chol B'chol Sharecha, Ela B'aretz Atamoishiv B'chol Plach U'Plach, B'chol Yir V'Yir, B'chutz La'aretz Atamoishiv B'chol Plach, V'Plach V'Atamoishiv B'chol Yir V'Yir. So the Ramban says, Pash Losh L'Sifri, V'Nira Mizeh, Shechayom Lemnoi Sanhedrin B'chutz La'aretz. Not B'chol Yir V'Yir, Ela Plachim. Im Kain HaMitzvah Zeis Nogis B'chol Zman B'dinei Momenos U'B'dvorim HaNidunim B'chutz La'aretz. Aber B'zman Hazeh Lacha Shebotlo Kaven Shekol HaMishpotim B'Teilem Min HaTorah. So it's not neig. And if we look at the Ramban, he's arguing the Rambam, and he thinks the Ram doesn't have a mitzvah minu in Chutz La'aretz. So what's the purpose of the Rambam telling us this here? According to the Ramban, that it's part of the mitzvah, I understand. But according to the Ram, we don't understand. So I think, in fact, the Ram says like this in Perek Aleph Halacha Beis Hilchos Sanhedrin: Ein ono chayovim lahamid b'otei dinim b'chol plach u'plach u'b'chol ir v'ir ele b'eretz Yisrael b'vad. Avo b'chutz la'aretz einon chayovim lahamid bezdin b'chol plach u'plach shenemar Titen l'cho b'chol sharecha. Asher Hashem Elokecha noisin l'chol shvatecha. So it means nothing. So why is the Ram talk about this here? So I think the answer is very simple. Because the Rambam in the Hakdama to Minyan HaMitzvos says the following: the oid kishe'ezko HaMitzvos she'eno noigos ela ba'oretz o b'fnei habayis yiu aseh lois aseh oimer v'zeh eno choyve ela be'eretz Yisrael. That's what he's basically saying, and he's saying, the Sifri seems to say that it is noig. That's only that they can be done, but it's not the mitzvah. U'borolon she'ein mitzvahs minui. So then it should, the mitzvahs minui is only buried Israel. So he has to say, the Sifri is not like that, and that's what he answers. The Sifri is only talking about that they can be done, but not about the mitzvahs minui. Then this line this line the Sifri, Maki Nefesh Bishkoga. So the Ram says, see, look at it, he says, Avo lo yodunu din in the forshes, lo ba'oretz, lo b'chutz la'oretz, ele im kein hoya bezdin beis habachira oimei, kmo shebi'anu psichas hamayim hazeh. So the Sanhedrin is not noyeg be'eretz Yisrael, b'chutz la'oretz, is only when it's not noyeg in Eretz Yisrael. And that's when the base of Mikdash is not Kayim. This is a little bit difficult, this line, because he says, V'yadua, this is towards at the end of the Hakdama to Minyan HaMitzvos, Shemelchama v'kiba she'aretz lo yiyu ela b'melech v'al pi Sanhedrin gedola v'koyin gadol k'mo she'om lifnei Elozar koyin yamod. U'lefi she'kol inyonim alol mufos meitzal roiv kol mitzvos aseh oy leisa say at least bekarbonis oy beavodes o bemisas bezdin o besanhedrin. What's o bemisas bezdin o besanhedrin o benovi o mechomo lo yitztach ben loima eno no heges el b'fnei habayis kiven shezeh boro kfi ma shizkalnu. So what does it mean? The Sanhedrin Agadol is only noeg b'fnei habayis. That's what he means. And that means Mochen Gerim. Like the Ramban, there's no Sanhedrin Agadol. What's all the Negolis? We speak about Kiddush HaChodesh. The whole thing becomes very odd. I'm just pointing out the problem. Now, next mitzvah. Mitzvah Kuf Ayin Zayin. Mitzvah Asheva v'shivim umeya. He shenitztavu adayonim lahashvois bein bale dinim u'sheyiyeh nishma kol echad mehem im orch dvorov o kitzurom. So reading it, there are two things happening over here. There's a general equation. The dayonim should treat both Balei Dinim the exact same way. Lahashveis being Balei Dinim. And then there's a separate, specific thing. U sheyihiyeh Nishma kol echad mehem im orech dvorim o kitzurim. He should let them speak as much as they want, probably on the topic. And the two separate things, an equation, and that each Baal Din has the right to present his case for it at length as he wants. However, the Rambam Mishneh Torah has a little bit different phraseology. In Perek Chof Aleph, Vichos and Hedron, Aloch Aleph, Beis and Gimel, Mitzvos Aseh, Lishpoid HaShofet B'tzedek. So I assume Lishpoid B'tzedek means, I would assume maybe that's assumed the double portion besides that, but in the Seder Maisa Bezdin, not only in the psak that it should be b'tzedek, but the whole tzura from the din should be b'tzedek. Lishpoid HaShofet B'tzedek shenem b'tzedek tishbar hamisecha. Ezel tzedek hamishbot ze hashvoyes shnei bali dinim b'chol dover. So he's saying the klal, and then there's a colon. In the Ram here, there's a klal, and then a specific example with a vav. So it's not part of the klal. We don't understand what this is. Like, we don't know what the vav means exactly. He also this is probably the original Arabic, there's a vav here. So I'm not sure in Kapachos, I don't know what the vav means. In Mishneh Torah, it's much more palatable that there's a general, that it should be equal for everything. And in specific, then he gives the specifics. Ezer. And he continues, he says, Lo yehei echod medaber kol tzorkoi, v'echod oimer lo katser dvorecha. He only says katser dvorecha to be succinct to one of them, not to both. V'lo yazbi ponim li echod. V'yedaber lo yirakois v'yeira ponov li acher. You should have the same facial gestures and tone of voice speaking to both of them. Shenemal, okay, excuse me. Shnei bali dinim shehoye echod mehem melubash begodim yikorim v'asherim melubash begodim bezuyim. He has to make sure, that everyone should be mechubadik, or everyone should be the same. Or whatever it is, there has to be an equation, and that's the colon over here. That's the Chaya Mishneh Torah, and that's Mistaba. I don't understand exactly how to read what are the two things here exactly. And it's not only in Mishneh Torah it's like that, it's also in the Minyan HaKotzer. Lahashvais bein balei dinin b'shor sho'im din b'din shenem b'tzedek tishbar hamisecha. So I'm not sure exactly what's going on here, but I see the Rambam both in Mishneh Torah and in Minyan HaKotzer seem to support that it's a general equation. Now, continuing. Uboa Perish Mekubal, Sifro, Shalei Echod Medaber Kol Tzorkoi, the Echod Atoim Eloi Kseh Devarecha. Exactly what the Rambam is presenting. This is the Pirush Mekubal. Then he does something. Until this point, everything is okay. No problems. Everyone's okay, and it's good. However, when you get to the next thing, things become a little bit interesting, I must say. What he's doing is he's going to introduce a new concept. We have a concept of lav shebeklolos, and now he's introducing a new concept, Aseh shebeklolos. And then I assume that the same way in lav shebeklolos, you moina the ikar mitzvah, and you talk about everything else. Okay. Lo yisrecha adam is the lav, the ashoro for ben Tzara Moira, and it has a lot of other things. Similarly, Aseh shebeklolos, you moina the ikar mitzvah, but tzedek, it means that there's an equation about Idvolim. And then the rest of the things that are included on the are peripheral. I assume that they're both the same. And then he says, V'zui achas me'akavonos, or that's what Ibn Tibbon says. The Kappa says, achas me'anyonim shekol aleim atzivui hazeh. Shekol aleim. Sounds very much like lav shebeklolos. Uboy gam kain, shekol ish mitzuva lodun din teira k'shiyeh yodeya boy u'shiyash b'sariv shebein balei dinim u'bei omu echod don es chaveru d'var teira shenema b'tzedek tishbar misecha. So l'chayr there's a mitzvah, there's a chiyuv on a dayan, I guess is royal lekach, to be done. Shekol ish mitzuva lodun din teira kishiyi yodeya boy. Or Kappa says im hoyeboki bekach. And what Ibn Tibbon says, Yashbis Oriv Shebein Balei Dinim, Kapach says, Heichalu Balei Dinim Esadiyun. I assume it's when Veheichalu Balei Dinim Esadiyun Lefonov. He said, I guess it's when they started. And they began, which is a very important point. The question is, it require Behechelo, his chiyuv is only if it starts. He doesn't have to take the case on. We have to understand what this means here, but that's what the words seem to say. Okay. Now, in Mishnah Torah, however, in Perek Beis, Halacha Yud, the Sanhedrin, Afa Pi She'ein Bezdin Pochas Mishleisha Muta Li Echod Lodun Min HaTorah Shnema B'Tzedek Tishbar Misecha V'Divrei Seif Ma'at Shiur Shleisha. So what does it mean, Muta? If there's a mitzvah, what's Muta? So it's not clear that in Mishnah Torah there is this concept of this is part of the mitzvah. And one could imagine, and we'll see the next case, could entertain the fact that the Rambam might deny there's such a thing as an Aseh shebeklolos. Then he continues and says the following. V'yesh Okay, then there's another case before we continue here. The in Hilchos with Sefer Shmiras HaNefesh, the Ram says in Perek Yud Gimel, Halacha Yud Beis, V'chein Shnei Gemalim Shehoyu Oilin B'maylo B'gavoya Pogazeh B'zeh Ketzed Hein Oisin Shtein V'chikes Shtein Koives Shtein Tunois Ho B'kulam B'doichek Echot Hatel Pshora B'neim. You should make a Pshora. V'hein Mailis Schar Zeh Lezeh U'B'zeh Kiyetz B'zeh Nema B'Tzedek Tishmeres HaMisecha. So the question is, he's talking about a pshora and maybe adarabah. Is this a mitzvah? Because he says hatel. Maybe it's not only a heter, and maybe adarabah, the mitzvah would express itself in hatel pshora. It's just odd. I don't want to get involved in that the Gemara in Sanhedrin, Alamed Beis, when it quotes the idea of Pshara, it doesn't quote it from B'tzedek Tishmeres Misecha, it quotes from B'tzedek Tzedek Tildoi. So this becomes confusing. What pasuk is the Ram quoting, and is it real? The next time that the Rambam quotes this over here for the third case, at least in Sefer HaMitzvos, he says like this: "Ubebeir omru, excuse me, v'yesh b'oid." Now here, this is pretty bad, I think. If it's the wrong translation. The Ibn Tibin has Sheroi Sheyodun Es Chaver Lekafschus, and Kapach translates it Shechoivo. Okay, and you understand if it's part of the mitzvah of B'tzedek Tishma V'Secha, so it's a mitzvah say deraisa. Have you done it called Lekafschus? It's not Roi, it's a Choivo. It's a mitzvah. For Yiforish Ma'asov Udvorov Elo L'Teiv V'Chesed. See here, I'm a little bit confused because the way he projects it in Pirush HaMishnah in always Perek Aleph Mishnah Vav B'Doros Kavel Kafschus in Yono Shim Yia Odom Shenu Yadua, and he says V'Loi Teda Hayim Tzadik Oy Rosha V'Tareu Tireu Oise Maisa O Oy Medovo Shim Yefurish B'Oifan Ma Hareu Toiv Yefurish B'Oifan Acher Hareu Ra Parsheo Kitoiv. So here, we don't know. It could be this is a mitzvah. And further on in Pirush Shnayis, Aval im hoya ish yadua shu tzadik mufusam ma'aser v'niu ma'aser shekol techunoisav yor al yosei ma'aser ra. He said you shouldn't be machriya it. Soch leforesh oisei ketev. Hoil v'yesh tzadif shows li'oisei tev. V'yein muter l'choishtoi. Kol chosh v'ksheirim loika b'guf. We don't know if this is a mitzvah havikol don l'kof schus, or it's a problem chosh v'ksheirim. You look at Shuvas Rambam. It seems to be in Shuvas Rambam Kuf Yud. This is part of the mitzvah of the Hadid Talmud Chacham to be done is Maisa Lachriim Lekaf Schus. It's not the Mishnah of B'Tzedek Tishmar HaMisecha. Look at Rav Ben Arama Matshuva, Siman Samach Vav, V'im Ze Noeg Eitzel Kol Adam, K'moi Shomu, Hari Achas Kam V'Kamo, Min Oroi Linag, Kach Legabe Anshe Chochma Badas. But this is odd, because then it's only Kal V'Chayma, so then it depends upon, we have to know whether it's a Midas Chassidus or Mitzvah to be done Kafskos. See, the problem is in Mishnah Torah. Because in Mishnah Torah, he only quotes it in Hilchos Deis. In Perek Hei Halacha Aleph, Shem Shachochem Nika B'Chochmo, Chochmosei V'mais Deoisav U'Muvdo V'Chulei, Kach Mitzorach Lios V'Masu Maten V'Mais V'Mesukonim V'Chulei V'Don Es Kolol L'Kavschus. And he says, Shemaisim Stumim L'Kaf Schus. He says, V'anachnu Chayovim Lodun Kololum Shemaisim Stum L'Kaf Schus K'div Chachomim Zal B'Musreihem. It's only Musa. That's an obvious, and it's only Musa. And maybe in Lidei Shleimus as Misha Makabel Musa. V'Avidon is calling L'Kaf Schus. So L'Chayr of Avram is clearly saying it's not the mitzvah. It's very difficult for me to imagine that the Rambam Mishnah Torah is referring to a mitzvah, because the Rambam Mishnah Torah doesn't quote it only place. He quotes it as the milas of Talmud Chacham. If it's a mitzvah deraisa, that's not the place for it only. I must confess, mi ani lahachnis roishi bein aholim, the Chafetz Chaim, in the Psicha, in the Aseh, seems to say, assumes that since he says the Sefer Mitzvah, he means the Mishnah Torah, even though he doesn't say it any place, and he says the one he quotes in the Chosdeis, that's the Din in Talmud Chacham. Generally say, Ezekiel Chosam Sefer, in Kabul and the Kabel. But then he says something very odd. He says that if you speak into Acherim, you tell Acherim how you would don them the Koil Kafschus, there's a problem, the Dibor in the Mitzvah Vedonas Kafschus. This to me is very odd. The Mitzvah Vedonas Kafschus is what you think in your head, what you verbalize, whether it's Lashon Ho, or Chilus, or Lifnei Iver, whatever, I don't know. But it has nothing to do with the Mitzvah Vedonas Kafschus, that's what I would say. Then I would add something over here. The Ram in Hilchos Sanhedrin in Perek Chaf Aleph Halacha Zayin Yud. V'chein Baal Din Muzo shelo yashmiya dvorav l'dayin kol mishyova Baal Din Chaveira. V'gam al zeh kiyetze boi nema b'dvar sheker tilchok. Minayin l'dayin. Excuse me, sorry. One second. I want to do. I'll leave this for next. I just wanted to hear. Let's see Perek Chav Beis, Halacha Beis and Gimel. One second. Here. Yeah. Here, I'd like to add one more thing here, and then I'll come back to it. There's a very interesting phrase here. In the next line in the Rambam, which completely confuses me. V'chva nisboiru mishpatei mitzvah zo v'makoymis mefuzorim min haTalmud. Okay? So I'm just, I'm pushing the yid, okay? What is the purpose of this statement? If you're saying the Ram at the end of the mitzvahs is basically an index amount for Ma'al Mekaymis to tell you where you find the dinim of the mitzvah, so I understand. He quotes the end, you'll find it in Huchasan, in Maseches Sanhedrin, you'll find this in Maseches B'chayris, and he goes through each Masechta and he tells you where he finds it, you find it. But what's the importance of a statement? It's somewhere. It's all over. What do you gain from that? It's a very odd thing to do. So I think that this would support my thesis that the reason why the Rambam discusses the Ma'al Mekaymis in general of the dinim of a mitzvah is because the Rambam wants to say that this mitzvah fulfills the paradigm of a mitzvah minyan mitzvahs. As the Rambam says in the Akdama, the Pirush Mishnayis, he says that they wrote in the Mikra, and Moshe Rabbeinu taught all the dinim, which were Teresh Baal Peh. And just like this mitzvah of Sukkah, which was like that, all Taryag mitzvah like that. So the paradigm of a mitzvah is Teresh B'Ksav and Teresh Baal Peh. And the Teresh Baal Peh is contained in Talmud Bavli. That is the Messiah. So comes the Rambam and says, no, Rabbi Yisai, it's important to make the following statement. Because it fulfills the paradigm of a mitzvah. And maybe even when he quotes the Ma'al Mekaymis, the purpose is not to quote Ma'al Mekaymis, but to say it fits in the paradigm of the mitzvah. Now, I'm not going to talk about this week. I'm just going to mention the question. There's a mitzvah of mitvah sheket tirchok, which the smag counts in Minyan Mitzvahs Kuf Zayin. The Chofetz Chaim, in his mitzvahs Aseh in the Psicha, counts mitvah sheket tirchok, but the Rambam does not count it. The question is why? Okay, and I'll discuss what the issues are next time. I just want to apologize. I think Monday next week will be a little bit too early for me to be prepared for a shiur in a way that I think you gain from it, or you might gain from it. I'd like to table the shiur to a week from next Monday. Amitz Hashem. Hatzlocha Rabo.